Hello, this is the Bite Weasel, and in this video we'll be continuing our Obby tutorial. This time, looking at how we can allow the player to skip a stage and move to the next checkpoint in exchange for a few Robux. So if you've been following along with the series, you should have a decent sized obby by now, with a whole bunch of different obstacles that players can traverse and enjoy. You should also have a checkpoint system, so that when they reach the end of an obstacle, if they fall off before they get to the end of the next one, they respawn at that save point. Now, a lot of obbies out there actually allow players to skip over a stage in exchange for a few Robux, and that's what we'll be looking at today. Now, this is great for the player because if they happen to find an obstacle that they're just not particularly good at, they can skip over it and actually continue playing the rest of the obby which they enjoy. And it's good for you because you can use those Robux to sort of fund future development so that you can make even more and even better games. So how do we actually make one of these things? Well, there's really 4 different parts that we need to do. Number 1, we need some sort of button on the screen that a player can click in order to say that they want to skip a stage. Number 2 is we need some sort of Roblox product that they can buy for Robux. Number 3 is we need a script to sort of handle that purchasing of a product. And number 4 is we need the script to actually handle the action of that purchase. In our case, skipping over a stage and moving on to the next one. So let's take a look at that first thing first, which will be adding a new button into our UI. Now we can do that by going down into this starter GUI service. GUI standing for Graphical User Interface. And on here, we can actually press the plus button and add a new screen GUI item. And this is basically a container that fills the entirety of the player's screen. And now you can add new things into this, such as a button. So we're going to add a quick text button here, and we're going to call it Skip Button. Go down into the properties, and we're going to change some of them around so that, for example, instead of saying button, it says skip stage. And we can also change the font here, maybe this one, and we can change the size, or we can do it automatically by choosing text scaled. Now we've ended up with this not very good looking button here, but hopefully you can spend a little more time making this look good on yours by changing around fonts, adding things like rounded corners and different colors and stuff like that. But for this video, this will do nicely for us. Unfortunately, when you start messing around with graphical user interfaces, you can get into a situation where you don't think about different devices that different players might be using. So I am going to show you a couple of tips on how to get around that. The first one is that if you go over to our test tab, which we used last episode, there is also this device button that allows you to sort of emulate what your screen would look like on all of these different kinds of devices. So for example, on an average laptop, this might be what you would see. The button is pretty nicely sized and we can click it, but if you were to look on something like a small iPhone 4S, you'll see that this button takes up nearly the entire width of the screen. So this is much, much too big on a phone compared to something like a tablet, right? So what you do need to be careful of when you start messing around with GUIs, in what it will look like on these different devices. So using this device emulation is a good idea because it will show you what it looks like and how big your button is on each of these types of things. Now, to actually fix this so that this button gets scaled way down on a device that has a much smaller screen, there are 2 things that I like to do. The first is to go over to the skip button itself and mess around with the size. Now, currently, a size for a GUI item is these 4 values in like 2 sorts of pairs. And if we expand out this, we can see what those actually are. The first pair is the X sort of values, and the second pair are the Y values. But why does each one have 2? Well, it's because they're actually 2 different kinds of numbers. This top one that they call scale is actually a relative size based on the size of the screen, and this offset is actually a hard-coded pixel value of the screen. So right now, we are 136 pixels wide, regardless of if we're on a screen that has not many pixels or we're on a screen that has many, many pixels. So the best way of doing this is to actually not use the offset at all, and instead change your values to use the scale. And so you can do that by sort of going here and changing the scale to be something like 0.1. And if we do that on both of these, what we'll see now is that the button stays the same relative size no matter how big the screen is, right? It's always covering just a small portion of the screen now. And the great thing is, after you've changed to use the scale value on a size rather than the offset value, now if you change it by dragging it around on your screen, it's actually going to change the relative scale sizes rather than the pixel values. So I like to always change my sizes over to scale and then drag them around, because that will always be changing the scale rather than the actual pixel values. And the other thing I like to do is actually add a thing called an aspect ratio constraint onto my GUI. So right now, what you're seeing is even though the size is now relative to the size of all the pixels in their screen, it's still sort of changing its shape based on what shape the screen has, right? So you see how this button is now really, really long and thin, whereas here it was sort of much, much shorter and fatter. And that's because they're scaling with the size of the screen rather than keeping their own individual shape and scaling that. So to actually fix this, what you can do is go back to your regular view, go over to the screen GUI, and add a thing called a UI aspect ratio constraint. And this will sort of keep everything having the same ratio or shape as the screen changes size. So now if I go back to that test tab and I emulate, you'll see the button stays the same relative shape. It's always this long, thin shape, no matter the size of the screen of the device. So that's really nice, and I always like to use those aspect ratio constraints and scale values whenever we mess around with GUIs. So there we go. Just a handy tip for you there when you come to make your button. But what's up next? Well, we have the button here, but next we need a script to sort of handle clicking that button. So what we're going to do is add a client-side script. So currently we've only ever used server-side scripts. And server-side scripts allow you to control things on the server that will happen for every single player. But a client-side script or a local script only affects that particular player, and each player gets a copy of that local script on their device. So we need to use a local script because each player has a different stage button on their device, and it will be different sized, and it might interact with the world differently depending on what device they're using. If they're using an Xbox, for example, it might happen with a button click. If they're using a phone, it will be a touch event and things like that. So we need to make sure that we add a client-side or local script. So down here under Starter Player, there are two areas of which you can add scripts. The character scripts, which sort of attach to the model of the player, or the actual player itself, which will happen when they first join the game and is really for all things to do with the player rather than just their model. So we're going to go down here and we're going to add a local script to the player scripts, and we're going to call it Client GUI. Right? And this is what will control our entirety of the client GUI. So now we need access to this individual skip button. And what you might think you would do is basically go game.getService, start a GUI, then screen GUI, then skip button. But unfortunately, that's not actually how you access things on the client. So the way that this works is this starter GUI is actually a template that gets replicated to each player as they join the game. So if I start the game now, what you'll see is that we still have this template under the screen GUI, but also if I look under players and my player, there is this player GUI that has this same copy of that template. And it's actually this copy that we need to grab access to rather than the template itself so that we can modify things on here. So to do that, what we're going to do is inside our client script, we're going to say game, get service, players service. And this is going to be very useful because the player's service has a thing on it called the local player. And this in a local script will always point to the particular player that is running the script, right? So on there is a thing called the player GUI, which was that folder that we just saw that got a copy of our starter GUI template. So from there, we can say local GUI equals this. And now we need access to our actual skip button. So normally you would say GUI.screenGUI.skipButton. Now the problem is this template takes some time to copy over to the player service. And that time is called replication. It has to go replicate this template from where it exists on the server to each individual client. And that can take some time depending on how fast the Roblox servers are today, whether the internet is sort of slow, and the sort of device that someone's using. So on client-side scripts, you almost never say dot. Instead, there is a handy function called wait for child. And this you can use instead because Roblox will sort of pause the script until this particular item has been replicated to this player. So on a client script, make sure that you always use wait for child instead of an actual dot to access something. So now here we've got access to our skip button. We can set that to be GUI.waitForChild, screen GUI, wait for child, skip button. That will give us access to these things here. Now, a button has on it a very nice event called the mouse button 1 click event. And we can hook up to that by connecting to it the same way that we connect up to any of our other sort of events that we've seen. Now, the mouse button 1 click event is actually pretty clever because you can use this and Roblox will know to actually fire this event if it is clicked by a mouse on a computer, if it's clicked by touch on someone's phone, or if it's clicked by an Xbox controller. So you can always use the mouse button 1 click even for devices that don't have a mouse. So that's really handy for us. So there we go. We have an event hooked up and we can actually do something here to prove it, like printing out hello. And now if I play the game, we should see that if I click this button, it says hello down here in the console because it's working. But one thing you might notice is that if you fall off and respawn, the button stops working. Now if I click it, absolutely nothing's happening. And that's because when the player died and respawned, they got a new copy of that template in here. So our events are still hooked up to the old one. That's no good. So to fix that, you can actually go into your screen GUI and turn off reset on spawn. And this will prevent the game from replicating a brand new instance of this every time they respawn. So much like when you add a new part into your world, you always anchor it. Whenever I add a new screen GUI into my game, I always turn off reset on spawn. Now, that might be different depending on what game you're doing and how your scripts work, but for me, I always make sure to turn this off. So now if we respawn, this will still be there because this button has not been re-replicated, so this will continue to work. So now we need to actually do something instead of printing hello. So the second step is to actually create a product that we can buy for Robux inside our game. And so to do that, you go over to your game and you open up the game settings. Now remember, you won't have access to the game settings unless you've saved this to Roblox itself, which we did last episode, so hopefully you have that. And now you can go down to monetization and scroll down here, you can create a developer product, which allows you to give it a name and a particular price. So here I've already created one and it's called Skip Stage and its price is 50. Obviously you can modify around with these things, give it a different name, give it a different price. But the interesting thing here that we need is actually the product ID. So you can click these dots and choose Copy ID to Clipboard once you've made a developer product for your game. Then we can go in here and we can sort of save that out by saying local skip ID equals that particular ID number. Now it will obviously be different on your game because each one gets a unique ID. But we're going to use that to now tell Roblox that we want someone to purchase this particular product. And you can do that with a thing called the MarketplaceService. So you can say game get service, marketplace service, and make that equal to some sort of local that you can then use. So we're going to say local marketplace service equals get service marketplace service. And then in here, you can use a function called prompt product purchase. And this is pretty easy because you can just get access to the local player and then pass in the ID that you want them to purchase. Now, the marketplace service is pretty clever in that you can use it on both the client and the server, and it will actually do the same thing. If you call this on the server, you pass in a particular player, that will work. And if you call it on the client, you pass in the local player, and that will work. And basically, it tells Roblox, hey, I want you to purchase this particular item for this particular player. And they will now get prompted when they press the button with this regular buy item dialog. And you can see here it says, would you like to buy, skip stage, cancel, or 50 Robux? Now, the interesting thing about doing this from Studio is that this is a test purchase and your account will not be charged. And that's great because it means you can test these things out in Roblox Studio without even having any money in your account. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to use these test purchases in order to make sure that all of this stuff is working. So right now I can click it and it will say it worked, but obviously we don't have any script that does anything when they buy the item. So that's what we're going to look at next. Let's add a new server-side script. So to actually handle the purchasing itself, you definitely need to do it on the server so that players cannot modify it on, malicious clients. So go over to here, add a new server script, and we'll call it Robux for things that actually happen with purchasing of Robux. And then we can get access to that same marketplace service. And in fact, we'll also need the player's service. So let's take both of those and go in here. Now, to actually handle the purchasing of something that you've asked Roblox to buy, you have to use a thing called MarketplaceService.ProcessReicipt. Now, this is very interesting because most of the things that we've looked at right now are actually events. So normally you would think you would do :connect and then add in a handler. But this is not the case with the ProcessReicipt function. It is actually a function that you have to override with the equals sign rather than connecting up to an event with the connect handler. So this is interesting because they only ever want your game to have a single instance of a ProcessReicipt function. So if you had another script that you wanted to handle other kinds of purchases and you did this same thing in there, this would cause a problem because Roblox is only ever going to run the latest one of these. So in this case, the bottom one, because it overrode this one. So they're trying to make sure that you only ever have one copy of these in your entire game. So make sure that that is the case by using equals function instead of a connect handler. Now this takes an interesting value in here that I can actually show you with the typing system. You get given a table that has a player ID, and that player ID is the ID of the player that is doing the purchasing. And then it also has a product ID that is a number that matches the product that they just bought. So this. Now in here, you actually want to handle purchasing of that item and performing whatever action it's supposed to do. But because you might have a bunch of different products by the time you finish your game, I'm going to show you a nice way to set this up so that you can use it in one place for the entirety of your game. But the first thing we're going to need to do is get access to the player that bought something. So we can say local player equals players get player by user ID, and then passing in info.player_ID. Whoops, not product ID, player ID. And then we can use our usual guard checks to say if not player because they left or something, return early. Now the interesting thing about this ProcessReicipt function is it actually expects a return value. Most of the things we've looked at right now are just events that don't ever have a return value, but this is a regular function that does expect you to return something here. And it actually expects you to return one of two things: an enum product purchase decision. And that value should either be Purchase granted if everything worked and Roblox should take the money out of their account because you gave them whatever they bought, or not processed yet if something went wrong. So make sure when you skip out early from this particular function, you do return a value of not processed yet. And this will tell Roblox, don't take anything out of their account because I wasn't able to actually give them what they bought. So whenever we do a guard check here, we need to make sure that we do this. Then next, what we're going to do is actually look up that product ID. So what you might think we should do is say if info.productID equals the value that we know about, then, cause the player to skip to the next stage. Now you could do this, but if you end up with a whole bunch of different product IDs, you're going to have an if else, if else, if else that goes way, way down here. And it's also going to look a bit wonky because now we can't do a guard check. We need to actually do something inside this if statement. So a better way to do this is to actually make a local table. And a lot of the examples online you'll find do it this way as well. So they have local products that is a new table. And then inside this table, they basically put a function for each individual ID like this. So there's the key, and we wrap it in square brackets because it's actually a number. So we tell Roblox, hey, this isn't an index in the table. It's actually a key with this value. And then they say equals function that takes in a player that is a player. And then returns either true if it worked or false if it didn't. So we're going to say false for now because we have not actually implemented this. So now instead of these big if statements, if else, if else, if else, we can actually check to see that this product that they passed in is in our product table. So we can say local callback equals products that match that product ID that they passed in. And then we can do our regular guard check. If there's not a callback, then return early. But remember, if we return early from this function, we need to give it this value to say, hey, it didn't work. But now if there is one, we can actually call it by saying local result equals callback and then pass in the player that we found. Now we can do another guard check. And we say, if not result, then exit early. Because if this returns false, like it does right now, it didn't work, so we return early. And then very finally, if it did work, we can say enum.productPurchaseDecision.purchase granted. So we get all the way to the end. It did actually work. Cool. So this you can actually use now for many different products by just adding a new function into the products table that has the matching ID for your new product and actually performs some action in here. So the only thing left for us to do now is implement the action. And so the action for our skip stage button should be to move the player from their current stage over the obstacle to their next stage. And we already have a script that sort of does something very similar to this, in that it's our checkpoint script. It has access to updating the player's data with that particular checkpoint, and it has the ability to sort of move a character to a particular checkpoint when they respawn. So how can we get our Robux script to talk to our checkpoint script? Well, there's a whole bunch of different ways, as you can imagine with programming, a million different ways to do the same thing. One of the ones that I'm going to show you, though, is pretty handy, and it's using bindable events. So a bindable event is basically an event similar to all these other events that you can connect to that we've seen, but it's a custom one that you make and you control. So we can go into our server script service, press the plus button, and find a bindable event. And we can give it a name, and we'll call it skip stage. And the great thing about bindable events is that you can grab access to them and you can either fire them from a script or listen to them from a script. So here we'll actually get access to that server script service by saying game.serverscriptservice.skipStage, and then you can choose to fire it. You can pass in any values you want to your particular bindable event. So we're going to just pass the player that purchased this skip stage item. And now we need something on the other end of this event to actually listen to it. So we can go over to our checkpoint script, and much like we listen to the player removing event or the player adding event, we can listen now to our skip stage event by connecting up to the dot event. So we can connect to that. It will be a function that takes in a player, that is a player. And then we can do whatever we need to do in here. And so we need to take some parts of this script and sort of make it work for our game. So when a player purchases a skip stage, they're basically going to want to do something very similar to our touch event. Right? But instead of setting the stage to be whatever they touched, it's going to set the stage to be one more than their current checkpoint. So we can get access to that checkpoint that they currently have using data for this particular player dot checkpoint. That will give us back the actual name of the checkpoint in our hierarchy. So for example, area 1, if that was the last one they touched, or maybe area 5, and so on. We need to increment it once, which means we really only need the number on the end so we can increment it. And we already have a handy function for doing that. It's this one right here. So we can say local current equals get the number for the stage, whatever's in their checkpoint. So this is going to return a number between 0 and however many areas we have. Then we can just increment it by saying plus equals 1. And now all we need to do is set that player checkpoint to that new number. So we can do that by getting the checkpoint and setting it to the word area combined with that new number suffix. Right? So if they come in with area 1, we're going to find the number 1, we're going to increment it to 2, and then we're going to set the checkpoint to be 2. And then here, what we're doing is we're updating the leader stats. So the one final thing we need to do is move that player. So we can do that with this code right here, which is our respawn code. So we can say player.character, which is the model for the player, pivot to the particular stage, which we know is going to be the stage under the area they just have, plus something. So we already have the word stage here, which is corresponding to their leader stat stage number value that we're incrementing. Instead, we will call this area dot stage. And we can grab access to that area by simply going area equals workspace to find first child of that new name. Area dot 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 current. Right? So that will give us the area, which is the folder with that matching name, and dot stage here will be the actual safe area that we're teleporting them to. So that will work nicely, but I think we should have a few guard checks in here. So if not player, then return early. And then we should double check that we can actually find this area itself. So let's move this up here. We can increment the stage, but then we should check that we can actually find it and say, if not area, because there isn't one, then return early. Otherwise, we're going to set the checkpoint to that particular area. We're going to update their leaderboard, and we're going to move the character to it. And with that all written, we should make sure we go back to our Robux script and change this return value to be true to say, yes, it worked, and the purchase has been granted. So that, in theory, should work. Let's test it out. So I'm here right now at the end. So that's going to be a problem. So what we first need to do is either change the script in our checkpoints to reset it back to 0, or if you have a plugin, such as the one I have here, we can actually go into our player data folder and delete our player's data. Now you can actually see 2 additional players in our data here, and that's from last episode when we checked out the local multiplayer. Player -1 and player -2 are the fake players that they add when you instantiate the game with a server and 2 local players. So we can actually see their data too. See that player 2 got up to area 1. So this is a really handy add-on, and I advise you get one similar to it if you're ever messing around with data stores. So now that we've done that, I should be able to play and start back from the beginning. Now let's say I'm unable to get to the next stage, which I am because I'm not very good. So what we can do is go over to skip stage, pay 50 Robux, but of course it's a pretend payment. And you can see that we bought the game, bought the product, and actually skipped over to the next stage, which is really, really nice for us. So now that we're here, if we're unable to get to the next stage because we're really, really bad, we should be able to just skip the stage once more and end up just before the turrets. So let's check, and there we are. So now players can continue to play the game, and if they ever happen to get stuck on something because they are just not particularly good at that kind of stage, such as me and moving platforms, they are able to just advance to the next one for a small price. And there you go. Pretty straightforward. So that's it for this video. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, like and subscribe, leave a comment, ring that notification bell, all that good stuff, and I will see you next time.